to our 5th Innovation-Based Instruction workshop. Before we begin, I'd like you to take a moment to consider the following question. Who are the knowledge keepers for and in your classroom? Additionally, I'd like to remind you that we have a variety of free resources available on the CuriositySpace website under New York Educator Resources. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Kath Jeremita. I want to be upfront and share that I'm not a classroom teacher. My background is in STEM, and I've been a practicing engineer for over 25 years. That said, I've spent much of my career working within the innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem, and throughout that time, I've had the privilege of collaborating with teachers and students, both formally and informally, in many different ways. Since the beginning, CuriositySpace content has been developed with teachers and students, letting their feedback guide us in how we bring the concepts of innovation, entrepreneurship, and STEM to the elementary classroom in a way that serves them. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video and consider the question I posed on the first slide. Who are the knowledge keepers for and in your classroom? Some options to consider are the teachers, the smarter kids, external resources, etc. Today's objectives are threefold. First, we'll discuss the concept of knowledge as a process. Then we'll dive into specific tips and tools to make learning alongside your students easier. Finally, we'll provide some resources and go through a practice exercise using some of those resources. It's better not knowing. While this first title is intended a bit tongue-in-cheek, there is some real value in research and development activities in having input from people who aren't biased by a ton of foundational knowledge. Of course, you don't want to reinvent the wheel, but sometimes a fresh perspective can be a game changer. Let's start by dispelling our first misconception. You don't need to know all the answers to be the leader for your classroom. I've led groups of people who know lots of things I don't know. Mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, even a number of chemical engineers, all working on hard, complex problems. In these cases, my goal isn't to figure out what the answer is. My goal is to help them get what they need for them to figure out the answer. Put another way, an effective leader helps their group achieve their potential. The second misconception is the thought that knowing is a binary state. Either you know or you don't know. This isn't the case. Knowing is a process, and we're always somewhere along the path of that process. So what do I mean by the idea that knowing is a process? Knowing basically follows a series of steps. First, you have a question or a wondering. Then you gather information about this question or wondering. Next, you need to think critically about the information you gathered. Finally, you either have more questions or perhaps you know a bit more than you did to begin with. Probably a little of both. Now let's spend a little time thinking about the steps in this process. What are some ways your students could gather information about their question or wondering? Some of the activities I have about how students can gather some more information about their question or wondering are to do some research, talk to an expert, maybe try an experiment, or make an observation. Once you've gathered some information, the next step is to think critically about that information. Do you have some ideas on how you might be able to help your students think critically about the information they've gathered? Some ways to help students think critically about the information they've gathered are: first, consider the source. Is the source trusted, or is it just something you found on the internet? Also, is the result expected? Can it be explained? And finally, do I notice any patterns? These last two are particularly useful when thinking about experimental results. So I've talked a little bit about the how in reframing knowing or knowledge as a process, but we haven't addressed the why. So why do you think it might be important to reframe knowing as a process for your students versus a more binary state? If knowing or being smart is a trait, like green eyes or brown hair, then students perceive that either they are smart or they aren't. Either they know or they don't know. It becomes a fixed identifier. On the other hand, if knowing is a process, then it's something everyone can participate in. Some might be a bit faster, but everyone can participate. It's a bit like running. No, I'm never going to run a marathon in 2.5 hours, but that doesn't mean I can't participate in one. I probably have to work just as hard, or perhaps harder, for my 5 hour marathon than the faster runners do for their 3 hour marathons. But just because I'm a bit slower doesn't mean that I'm not a runner or that I can't participate. The same is with knowing and knowledge. Secondly, knowing as a process more accurately represents how research and development is done in real life. Starting to model this at an early age better prepares students who might go into science or engineering for what it's really like. Honestly, I should probably have a much thinner line leading towards know a bit more than you did to begin with, because mostly scientific wonderings and questions generate many more questions before they generate any answers. Now, not having all the answers is easier said than done. For this section, we're going to discuss some phrases and resources to help create a knowing is a process environment in your classroom. Please take a minute to think about some phrases that might work well when students ask you something you don't know the answer to. Here are a few that have been suggested in the past. That's a great question. How do you think we could answer that? I've never thought of that. Let's look in or look at. That's interesting. Who do you think we could ask about it? That's something I would need to learn about too. Where do you think we should start? Is there an experiment or test you could do to help figure out the answer? Please take a minute to think of some places you could suggest your students go to help as they gather information. Here are a couple of suggestions of places to look for information about questions or wonderings. First and foremost, trusted websites. Places like PBS, Nova, Nature, National Geographic, larger newspapers, and museums are great websites to gather information that you know has been vetted by the technical community. Open source websites are also a good resource. YouTube, Wikipedia, even ChatGPT. Just remember, you need to reinforce the critical thinking piece. And on the ChatGPT or AI front, I know it's not our favorite way to direct students, but they're going to use it, so it's important to teach them how to use it responsibly. One of the ways that it can be very helpful is to take information from the trusted website and simplify it for the age group you're looking for. For example, a command like, please rewrite this for an elementary student, and then pasting a paragraph or two might really help students understand information from that trusted website. Of course, local experts, librarians, parents, high school teachers, community college teachers, etc., are always great places to go to find information on questions or wonderings. And then company websites, especially for new companies, often have easier to understand explanations of the things that are important. Look for the problem or our story or even our technology for easier to understand summaries. New companies are often trying to explain their technology to people who can provide funding. venture capital firms, foundations, etc. And highly technical groups are encouraged to explain their technology as they would to an elementary student, so the investors would understand. Now let's try it out. First, we're going to read through the pre-read entrepreneur vignette. Then I'd like you to think about some questions or wonderings you have. Then work to gather some information on those wonderings. A website starter list is provided in your resource packet. Let's meet Serge and Ian, co-founders of Ecospheres. About Serge and Ian. Serge Albano was born in the Philippines, but grew up in New York City. I grew up just down the road from the Hudson River. When I learned about the pollution in the river, I knew something had to be done, said Serge. While he was an engineer at NASA, Serge met Ian Dormel and realized Ian was also interested in cleaning up the pollution from the water supply. Foundational science. Have you ever tried to mix oil and water? They make a lot of bubbles, but the two liquids do not mix. This is because oil and water are made of two different types of particles that do not like being together. Similarly, there are many other liquids and solids that mix well with water, called hydrophilic, or mix well with oil, called hydrophobic, but not with both. Game-changing idea. Many harmful chemicals that are in our water supply, such as streams, rivers, and lakes, are happier in the oil than in the water. However, when these particles get into our environment, they are hard to remove. This is where Ecospheres technology can help. Originally designed by a team of engineers at NASA, led by Dr. Jacqueline Quinn, each sphere contains a special oil-like liquid that the harmful particles like more than water. The shell of this sphere is made from a special plastic that lets harmful particles come in but will not let the oil leak out. After the harmful chemicals have moved into the sphere can be removed, making the environment healthy again. Now, please take some time to think about some questions you might have about Serge or Ian, Ecospheres, or the technology they've developed. What questions do you have, and where might you look for answers on those questions? This brings us to the end of today's session. As usual, I would encourage everyone to do a 3-2-1 reflection. What are 3 things you learned or rediscovered today during this session? What are 2 things you're still thinking about? And what's 1 thing that you will commit to trying in your classroom? That brings us to the end of our 5th workshop, Being Comfortable Learning Alongside Your Students. I hope you found these workshops useful, and as always, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Until next time, happy inventing.